Anyway, he was on his way to Canada, but he was smart enough to realize that he could learn from the Indians, and he did. And they ultimately learned to respect him, and he learned to know more about how they fought and how they lived. He was ransomed in Canada for $103, price of an Indian pony. Big deal, huh? But at least he was free, and that's where he really learned the meaning of the word free. So he came back to his home in Manchester. Time went by, years went by. French and Indian Wars came along. He became part of Rogers' Raiders. He was an Indian fighter with the British, but with Rogers' Raiders all during that time. Then that kind of ended because the British kind of withdrew their support and let the Indians have their way. And he met and married a young lady named Elizabeth Molly Stark. Her nickname was Molly. She was pretty feisty little gal too. She could shoot as well as he did. And they raised a family. They had 10 children ultimately. And while all this was happening, all of this stuff was going on with England that we were talking about previously, all these things that the king was doing. And even though John Stark was in Manchester, New Hampshire, he heard about what was going on in Boston, and he didn't like it. He didn't like the Boston Tea Party. He didn't like the Boston Massacre, the acts, the taxing. He didn't like the port of Boston being closed. He thought that was not right. Buildings being occupied. Massachusetts charter was revoked. None of these things he liked, but he was still thinking that maybe there was a compromise with this king. Maybe he was still a loyal subject. He wasn't ready to call it quits with England. But he was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and he did do some militia drills. Well, when the lid blew off in April 19th of 1775 in Lexington and Concord, he was in Manchester working at a sawmill. His great virtue was that he could think that he could sort of sense what was going to happen before it happened, sort of like seeing into the future. So he told Molly, he wasn't really sure what was going on down there, but he thought something was going on. And what he said was to her, he said, "'Twould be best if my saddlebags were packed with some of my duds and 3 days' provisions." He says, "I sense something, but until we know for sure, I'll try to finish sawing these logs." So he went back to the sawmill to work, and Molly packed his duds and got the food ready and the horse ready and waited around for word of what was going on down south. And how did they know there was anything going on down south? Before the internet, how did word get passed around? People on horseback. And they went to towns, and churches rang bells, towns shot off cannons, and that's how everybody knew that something was going on. And then the horsemen came through, the riders came through to tell them what it was. Now imagine if it was total separation of church and state, there would have been no church bells to ring. There would have been no alarms to set off. So that church and state thing doesn't work well. Anyway, they had heard the church bells, they had heard the cannon. Molly waited for word to come from somebody she recognized, and finally it did come from a Son of Liberty that she recognized, so she had everything ready for him, and she told the kids, "Go tell your pa, go fetch your pa at the mill," she said. So Pa came. John Stark came within 5 or 10 minutes. He was there. He jumped on his horse, he kissed his wife goodbye, he kissed his kids goodbye, and he was off to Boston town. Now it takes me from where I live in Manchester about an hour or so, an hour and a half to get to Boston. It took him 4 days, but he used the time well. Everywhere that he stopped along the way, on the way to Boston, he gathered men. Men came to him because he was a leader. They knew he was good. They knew he was a leader they could follow. So when he finally made it to Boston, to Cambridge, where everybody was gathering, he had 2,000 men gathered together that were going to follow him where he said. And they got together with people that came from all of the other parts of the colonies, and General Washington was appointed the commander. And Molly came down at that time, during that time too, because shortly after that there was Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill and all those battles, and the British getting bottled up in Boston. He was part of all of that, and she was part of that too. In fact, when the British decided to hightail it out of Boston and go for New York, they weren't really sure that that was really legitimate. They thought, well, maybe the British are just, pretending to leave. They're going to come back and get us good. So Molly's job was just to watch and be sure that they really were leaving. They really meant it. They were really pulling out. The ships were leaving the harbor, and that's what she did. And so the battle went on. John Stark was part of all of the things that happened after 1775, all throughout the next year. They still didn't have the Declaration of Independence. They still didn't know what they were doing. They were just kind of fighting each other all over the place. It was not going well for the colonials at all. They were not winning, were they? Not winning at all. They were really getting beat on all sides. Finally, at one point in time, John and his men ended up at Ticonderoga. Do you know that name? Up on the lakes. It's up north of Albany, New York, and it's an important place. And they were there, and they were defending that. And he looked around, and it sounds like a Valley Forge scene. Everybody was in tattered clothes. They were hungry. They were beat up. They were wounded. They were walking around on sticks, and they were depressed. But at that particular point in time, the Declaration of Independence came to him as a commander of troops. And they probably were thinking, is this really worth it? Are we really, is this worth pursuing? Should we just all go home and forget it or what? They may have been thinking that, who knows? But at any rate, the Declaration came to him, and he was ordered to read it to his troops. So he lined them all up. And they were a pretty sorry-looking group. And he read them, those famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident and when in the course of human events." He read that all to them, and it kind of like, it was like the light bulb went on with him, too. Now it made sense. Now it really made sense what they were fighting for. They were fighting for something much bigger than little quarrels. They were really fighting for a country of their own. And this is what he said. He said it was electrifying, the response that he got from the men after he had read the Declaration of Independence to them. There was a complete silence, and then there was a great cheer that went up. And hats went in the air, and guns went in the air, and everybody was really happy and recharged. And they didn't use any powder because powder was too scarce, but they did. It really invigorated the troops. He went on to win in a very important battle in Bennington, Vermont, much later in the game. It was a game changer in the war because the British were coming down from Canada, and if they had made that sweep through Vermont and New Hampshire and into Massachusetts, it would have been curtains for all of us. We would still be British subjects today. But he stood them off at Bennington, Vermont, when the odds were totally against him. Vermont was full of British sympathizers. Burgoyne had a lot of troops, and Stark said, "No, we've got to stop him tonight. We've got to beat him here, or Molly sleeps a widow tonight." And those are the famous words. Bottom line, we won. 30 killed, 40 wounded on our side, 596 lost on their side, 700 prisoners, 150 Tories. It was a turning point in the war, and other nations looking at that decided that we were worth it. We meant it. France came into the fight. Everything changed from that point on. So it was really a turning point in the war. And I just want to conclude this with something that seems really important to say. Fast forward all of this to 1809. John Stark is now 82 years old. The war's over. We won. We're a nation. But he's still full of fight and wisdom. And the people at Bennington, Vermont want him to come and re-celebrate that victory, that important victory with them. He can't come. He says he can't come. He's just not able to come, physically able to come. But he says, "You wish my sentiments? These you shall have, as free as the air I breathe. As I was then, I am now, the friend of the equal rights of man, of representative democracy, of republicanism, and the Declaration of Independence, the great charter of our national rights, and of course our states." He said a lot of other things, but you can read that sometime. But what I want you to get is the P.S. he put on that. He couldn't be there, but he said, "I will give you my volunteer toast. Live free or die." state motto of New Hampshire, and isn't that a very concise way of saying we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors? Live free or die.